What's up, Inland Empire? Welcome to Inland Insight with IECN. My name is Manny Sandoval, co-owner and publisher.
And I'm Denise Berver, co-owner and co-publisher.
So we're very excited today because we have Dr. Thomas Corrigan, local news media analyst and professor of media studies at CSUSB. So, Dr. Corrigan, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we're excited to hop into today's episode, diving into the state of local news in the Inland Empire, its challenges and its future. So, Denise, let's start off with I think you got the first question.
So this is a topic that's crucial to the understanding of local journalism. Two terms, news mirage and news deserts. Can you give us a little background on what exactly those terms mean and how they're relevant to areas specifically in this Inland Empire region?
Yeah, so, nationally, news deserts are a really important research topic. Over the past 20 years, we've just seen a gutting of the advertising market for newspapers especially, but journalism more broadly. Mm-hmm. And the result of that, and we're talking, a fall from, roughly $80 billion of inflation adjusted in the early 2000s to less than $10 billion today, just a huge drop off. And what's happened is we've had a closure of roughly a third of all newspapers in the United States, and an elimination of about 2/3 of newspaper journalists' jobs, right? And this is important because newspapers still produce most of the original journalism in local communities. And so, the effects of those cuts, one is that, we've got areas that just don't have local news. There's a major study out of Northwestern University's Medill Local Journalism Institute by Dr. Penny Abernathy, and her numbers say that roughly 70 million people in the U.S. live in a county that has either one or no reliable local news source, right? And so this is, what she refers to as a news desert. Now, if you look at those maps from her and her team, the Inland Empire doesn't show up as a problem area. By her numbers, we've got 48 news outlets in between San Bernardino and Riverside County, and I've actually found others that exist beyond just those 48. But to me, the question is not how many news outlets, right? But the quality and the substance of the journalism, right? And so when you start digging into those local news outlets, you start to find some troubling patterns, right? So one of the most glaring ones to me is what we see with local dailies, right? So in our, in the sort of the heart of the Inland Empire, you think about like the San Bernardino, Riverside, Ontario metro area. The two-county area has 4.7 million people. You put those, surrounding cities around San Bernardino, Riverside, and Ontario together, you got more than 3 million folks. And the local dailies in those areas, San Bernardino Sun, Riverside Press Enterprise, Inland Valley Daily Bulletin, and the Redlands Daily Facts, if you look at their news coverage on a day-to-day basis, those four newspapers, little variation in the Redlands Daily Facts. The other three, though, 100% duplication of stories. The same stories, the same photos, the same advertisements, the same obituaries, right? All that changes on a day-to-day basis is swapping out the masthead, right? So, and this is not to demean the journalists in these organizations. You got folks like Bo Yarborough and Jeff Horseman. They're doing solid, beat reporting about local government and politics and these sorts of things, but they're operating in a context. Those four newspapers are owned by Southern California News Group, which is owned by Alden Global Capital. They're a hedge fund that has been buying up newspapers across the country, gutting staffs, and in the Inland Empire, publishing one regional newspaper that masquerades as four local ones, right? And so I've been using the term news mirage to describe what we've got here in the Inland Empire. There are other facets to it, but daily newspapers are really essential to sort of that day-to-day beat reporting about what's happening in city government, what's happening in school boards, zoning commissions, that sort of stuff, and it's just being hollowed out.
Yeah. Right. And this actually recently occurred just the past couple of weeks. It was announced that TMG purchased Century Media Group, right? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Times Media Group is a media company out of out of Arizona. And they own about 40 community weeklies in the Southwest, mostly in Arizona and Southern California. And they recently purchased the Century Group papers, and they include weekly newspapers like the Redlands Community News, the Yucaipa-Calamasa News Mirror, Fontana Herald News, and the Banning Beaumont Area Record Gazette. And they purchased these papers from the longtime owner of those papers is Jerry Bean. Mm-hmm. He was retiring. He sold the paper as a businessman. He's right. Welcome to do. But what we've seen recently is some really disturbing developments at this now out-of-state owned set of local newspapers. Right. Mm-hmm. One is that 3 of the 4 editors at those papers were all fired within the first couple weeks. They've also gone and reduced the extent to which they have contributions from local community members. Freelancers were paid really not a ton, $35. Yeah, right. $35 an article, right? Plus some for photographs. But even those costs were costs that were a bridge too far. Mm-hmm. And so we've got at those newspapers, they're relying more on staff, but those staff are also being hollowed out, right? We've got reporters who have resigned recently. Mm-hmm. And you've got the editor of the Yucaipa-Calamasa News Mirror,
Rachel.
She's now also the editor of the Redlands Community News. Fontana Herald News and the Record Gazette in Banning, those 2 papers now, their editors are out of state. Right. Oh, wow. And so you've got, local news becoming less local at these publications. So, and they've also closed 3 out of their 4 offices. Right. So these are, and I don't want to, prejudge too much. They might, this company might have, great social media innovations that help these publications reach more readers. But these sorts of hollowing out of newsrooms are really problematic and sort of, consistent with what we see across the industry more generally.
Right. So, I know there's weekly newspapers, news websites, podcasts, radio stations. I think radio stations is probably the biggest, media medium in the Inland Empire. But how so is the Inland Empire specifically a news mirage? What's like one sort of concrete example that you can draw that back to?
So, I mentioned the Alden example, right? And I think that's the most glaring thing. But there are a couple other dynamics, right? So one is in the heart of the Inland Empire, right? That San Bernardino, Riverside, Ontario area, you've got, you have no dedicated local TV newscasts, right? Mm-hmm. There are, Palm Springs has its own media market, small media market. But in San Bernardino, Riverside, Ontario, though we are part of the LA media market, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you turn on your quote unquote local TV news, right, you get LA stations that are piping in newscasts mm-hmm. to the Inland Empire, but it's not by and for Inland Empire residents, right? And when they do cover the Inland Empire, it's a crime scene.
Fires.
Right. You've got
all negative news.
Yeah, mm-hmm. car chases, violent crime, et cetera, right? And not that those aren't things that, have a place in the news landscape, mm-hmm. but it shouldn't be all we get, right? And, to put things in context, the Inland Empire is the 12th largest metropolitan statistical area in the country, right? It's the 5th largest Hispanic population in the country, behind only New York, Miami, Los Angeles, and Houston, right? It's supposed to grow twice as fast as the rest of California over the next 25 years. We should have our own TV stations, right? And we should have our own newscasts. And the fact that we don't is frankly just, it's an inequity, right? Mm-hmm. And should be corrected.
Last night, we both kind of were separately reading the article that you're in the middle of working on, but there was one term that really stood out to me as obviously a publisher and a journalist is journalism. Yes. And I think so many journalists and news publications don't even realizing that they are actively participating in what is necessarily just manipulation, but also just public relations. And speak on that, please.
Yeah, so journalism, it's not my term, right? But I think it's really instructive for just thinking about how you can have something that looks like journalism, right? Mm-hmm. That looks like news, but when you peel back the layers, you see that it's something quite different. So it refers to news organizations and journalists who, and I don't blame them, right? A lot of folks were, wearing many hats, right? And pressed for time and resources. And, there's this push of public relations material, right, that's coming at us on a regular basis.
I love
right?
the Amazon example.
Yeah. So, and what ends up happening is when you either rely on that material and don't end up asking enough questions about the story and that's described in the press release, you first of all, it sort of shapes the news agenda to reflect what PR wants us to focus on. But also it can
strategic.
It can really, it can hand over a lot of influence to folks that journalists, frankly, should be holding accountable, right? Law enforcement, politicians, major corporations. So Amazon to me is the best example locally, right?
Right. I think you referred to it as potentially dangerous. Is that why there's no system of checks and balances that journalists would normally provide?
Yeah. So let's look at it this way. So last December there was this big document leak out of Amazon that showed that, and it was they described it as their community engagement plan. Right. And what it was their plan for trying to deal with community opposition to their warehousing, right? Whether that was, frustrations over labor violations, pollution, we've got the worst air quality in the country, right? Community displacement as a function of these big warehouse developments coming in. And, a lot of attention was paid to, Amazon pulling its money from the Cheech, the museum, right? For, a particular, exhibit that was, anti-warehouse, right?
Yeah. Right.
There was, they had effectively like an enemies list, right, of politicians. Yeah. To me, the big thing, though, is that whole document is about how they get news stories placed that present Amazon in this sort of friend of the community light, right? Right. And those sorts of, the pressures of resources and time that make it, easy to pass along those sorts of press releases as news coverage, make it so that a company like Amazon can effectively, carry out a propaganda campaign that is, facilitated by local news, right? And I'm not suggesting that there hasn't been good critical coverage of Amazon, right? But there's also a need to, when working with a press release, to make sure that we're bringing in a diversity of sources. My advice is, if it's working from a press release, put press release in the headline, right?
Gotcha. No, that's some great insight, and it really makes me pose the question: is like, so do you think that the, not necessarily downfall, but the diminishing of, journalism is the result of the influx in public relations jobs and positions? Because almost every major company and corporation these days invests a lot of money in public relations. Everything from, you mentioned, I think some organizations, corps, they consider it strategic philanthropy, and it's a strategy to basically, elevate their public face to their constituents. So,
yeah. I mean, it's a whole field, corporate social responsibility, right? Which is, I also, another term for it is propaganda, right? And so, and I don't want to suggest that there aren't folks who have their heart in the right place, right? But in the context of news, a journalist's job is not to pass along what a company or what a politician or what law enforcement wants to be said about them, but to, hold powerful people to account.
Right.
Do you feel like this journalism is kind of a byproduct of the budget cuts and the lack of funding? Because a lot of staffs are very small, so you kind of have to fill the space with the press release, or you feel like you might have to. So when something comes in and, hey, just plug this in, if you don't have a staff, or, you may just feel like, okay, we'll get this in for them, and, maybe.
Yeah, and it's not new. Like these practices have been around for decades. In my dissertation research, I cite some folks who were talking about it in the 1970s as a problem then. But you've got trajectories that are heading in the wrong way, right? You've got dwindling staffs, dwindling budgets, people being asked to, wear many hats, right? And when you're asked to wear many hats, your time is precious, right? And so, and if you've got a quota to fill, and the quotas have gotten wild too, because you're talking about, an endless space online that you can fill stories, right?
Right.
And so to me, it's not surprising when these sorts of practices happen, but there's also an ethical set of expectations.
Right.
And you worry about, the thing I worry about is questions of trust too, right? And if when you get these Amazon document disclosures and it shows how they have effectively used journalism to facilitate their, not my term, corporate manipulation campaign, right? That should, raise questions among journalists, about the extent to which they participate in that.
Yeah. And it just makes me, and I've thought about this many times too, because both of us, we wear a lot of hats, and I find myself sometimes, even managing social media in all other sectors of the environment. That's a full-time job, just social media on its own. For some companies, even just shooting video is a full-time job. Just doing the copywriting is a full-time job. Just doing research. So it's a lot.
You only have one full-time.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's if anyone can relate, actually crying on the inside right now. But no, and I've seen. So I would say, just to be completely transparent, I would say what we publish is about 50-50. So 50% is journalism, and that is to fill the space. But then I have also seen other weeklies, and it's all journalism. Don't want to call them out, but they're local in the San Bernardino area, and it's all press releases. So it's a tough ground that we're all playing in, and you're right about that. It comes down to being ethical from a journalistic standpoint. And there was a quote in there. Was it Orwell, I believe? And I really liked what the quote was. It said something along the lines of, journalism is publishing what people don't want you to publish about them. Public relations is...
Everything else is public relations.
Yeah.
So, and when I'm trying to just put some language on these sorts of dynamics, to me, a term like the news mirage is an effective way to describe what's going on. I want to give you one more example, just because I think it's helpful. So there's this growth in what are referred to as pink slime websites. So pink slime websites are these websites that look like local news websites. They have names that sound like local news websites. East SBV Times for San Bernardino Valley, right? Northwest Riverside News, right? And there's about 75 of these under one company called Metric Media, just in California. They've got more than like 1,100 nationwide. I think by some measures they put out more news than any other news organization in the country. But then when you actually read what they're publishing, right, it's AI generated low value stuff, right? And they also tend to push some pretty right wing positions, and you'll have for instance, there was a recent set of stories that argued that, or it was making the claim that Democratic Congress people across the country had voted to allow, in the headline it said voted to allow illegals to vote in U.S. elections. And it was, very, biased, manipulative distortion of what the bill actually was that they were voting on.
They called out Rep. Aguilar, I believe, in that, right?
Right. So Representative Aguilar, Nina Torres locally. And to me, the thing is, manipulation and bias, that's been happening, since there have been newspapers, right? The thing that to me is makes this part of a news mirage is that it was the same story being duplicated all across the country, with just swapping out the local congressperson's names, right? To make it seem as though there was this local news reporting that was happening, but there wasn't, right? Yeah. It's, it's a pink slime is the term they use to describe these websites.
Social media sensationalism. I want to touch on this too, and kind of pose the narrative, which I know maybe about a month or so ago, there was a sort of news tip that was floating around in regards to a department store in San Bernardino, around the San Bernardino Highland border. And I think the story that Inland Empire Pages, its social media page that has over 200,000 followers, and I think they received a tip that there was a bust for
trafficking, like human trafficking.
Exactly.
Sex trafficking.
For sex trafficking.
The actual term, yeah.
And it ended up being false, but they ended up publishing a video, I think, and a photo, or a video and photo.
It was a photo and a Facebook, a very grammatically challenged Facebook post that they shared on their page. So and it was a post that was it should have raised red flags right away, right? You've got this, grammatically incorrect post. Not that you can't have information from folks that might, struggle with grammar, but it was, the post itself should have raised some red flags. And they republished it. They put a note that said this has not been verified, which you should maybe raise some questions about. Well, why would you not verify it before posting it? And it was pretty quickly debunked, right? Including from the San Bernardino Police Department. Right. They said, hey, there was a cartel-related bust in Highland, actually in multiple locations. But there was no human trafficking involved, right? And the post said that there had been 60 women and children who had been sex trafficked by the cartel, right? And so commenters said, hey, this is false. You should take this down. I was in the comments and writing messages saying this is irresponsible. You got to take this down. You got to correct this. And eventually they went and put a note that basically said, this information is confirmed as false, right? But you had to open up the post to ever see that note, right? So the post remained up. Over the next few days, it had more than, I think, close to 700,000 views, 12,000 likes, 29,000 shares, right? And I mean, these are huge numbers, right? They reach, at the time they reached 237,000 followers. They're up now closer to 260,000 followers. And that's power, but that's also responsibility, right? And so this is, and I don't want to paint social media generally as social media is it's a platform, it's a tool, right? And it can be used well. And there are folks doing really solid journalistic work online and on social media. And so I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here, right? But there are these pages and these community groups where we see material being shared that might be misinformation in some cases. A lot of times it's just a lot of sensationalism, right? It's a lot of videos of car crashes and chases, a lot of violent crime, and frankly, that might get clicks, right? It might get eyeballs. But in terms of helping to inform folks when they go to, pull that lever when they're voting for city council or, those sorts of things, it's just not valuable. It's not valuable. It's not providing a whole lot of substance. And so, this is trouble. This is part of the problem.
Right. And then something like that instance in particular, something like that, it's debunked quickly, but it spreads even faster than and it continues to spread.
And it's correcting misinformation. I mean, researchers have found it's just extremely difficult to do, right? Once the misinformation's out there, even efforts to debunk it can actually instill misinformation, just as you're trying to explain this thing is false. People hear the thing before you say this is false, right? And so that's a problem.
And that's what sticks in their head.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So for these pink slime websites and obviously these social media, news accounts or news accounts that are, they're posing to be news accounts, not nudes, news accounts. What's their revenue stream? How do they pull in profits?
So, I mean, as best I can tell, a lot of this is a lot of these pages, right? What they do is they do a lot of promotion for local businesses, right? What is sometimes referred to as sponsored content, right? So, it's a local restaurant or a hair salon or whatever that wants more business, right? And what they do is they put together a post that promotes that local business. They got a big following, and folks come in to patronize their establishment, right? And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but having that kind of following and also sharing news, you're engaging in journalism,
It's
right?
a blurry line.
Yeah, and now you've got an ethical responsibility, and advertising, in my opinion, is always has a tenuous relationship with news in the first place, but yeah, that sort of promotional culture that's baked into those accounts, if the goal is clicks and eyeballs, that can create some troubling incentives when it comes to the journalism.
Right.
Gotcha. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, not to mention the legalities. I mean, where's the accountability? Where's the, where's the line that they cross where this is illegal to post?
Yeah,
And
so
I know this is just an assumption and probably a generalization, but I get the feeling that they're not paying their fair share of taxes either. Like, I don't know. That's just an assumption.
No
that I'm making,
comment.
So. But Denise, you have the next question.
So the Inland Empire Community Foundation recently launched an initiative called the Inland Empire Journalism Innovation Hub. They're very focused on what they call cooperative journalism. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of cooperative journalism, especially in areas like the Inland Empire, where I know, speaking from experience, traditionally community newspapers were competitors because we were fighting for the same ad dollars, the same market, and now it's becoming increasingly important that we work together because there aren't very many independent newspapers left.
Yeah, so there's a guy named Jesse Hardman who runs Listening Post Collective, which has done a lot of research on local news in the Inland Empire, and he describes the area not as a news desert, but as an information garden. That there are folks doing important work, right? And sometimes small operations might be one or two people, right? But they're dedicated, communicate. They might be journalists, they might be citizen reporters, but they're creating information that's valuable to their local community. But when it's just one or two folks, right? You're gonna need you need a village there to make that work. Right, and so the Inland Empire Community Foundation, they've launched this journalism innovation hub plus fund, and their focus is really around this cooperative journalism model, right? Which, as you said, historically newsrooms have competed, but to be able to produce some reports and certainly to be able to reach the kinds of audiences that important stories need to reach, sometimes you need to work together, right? And in doing so, you might produce even better journalism, right? So Paulette Brown-Hines, who's the publisher of Black Voice News, is the chair of the Hub Plus Fund. Armando Carmona from Tizunu Strategies is the executive director, and I think that this cooperative journalism model that they're focusing this hub around is really an important contribution. I'll give you an example of this cooperative model in practice that I think is really instructive. So over in Bloomington, they've got this big warehouse development that's in the process of happening, right? And there's a publication called the Frontline Observer.
Oh, yes, we've worked with them.
Yeah, Anthony Victoria he's the founder of the Frontline Observer, and he and one of their reporters, Christopher Salazar, they produced this really terrific piece called Pavement Politics.
It really was.
Yeah, I know you all
we reprinted it.
Inland Empire Community News. You reprinted it. Anthony is a UC Berkeley local news fellow, right? And so he went and he took this great report, repackaged it as an audio piece for KVCR, where he's a local news fellow, and has now that reach of KVCR. And so, but it's also cooperative in other ways, right? So he worked with students at Pitzer College to produce this piece. They went and studied the campaign finance donations that were, sort of greased the wheels for this developer to push through the planning commission decisions to have this warehouse development go forward. And also, his background, he was a co-founder of the People's Collective for Environmental Justice. And, he provides fair and accurate reporting, right? But he's also really well networked with the activist and environmental community. And so his reports, and that pavement politics piece in particular, was able to incorporate community viewpoints and experiences, but also to just have his finger on the pulse of what was happening with community organizing and environmental activism around that story. And so you've got that you got the university cooperation, you've got the activist community cooperation, you've got local media, and then they've also got this artist dimension, right? So they've got local artists who went and they created what was called Bloomington Speaks, which was this big sculpture of packing boxes, because it's a warehouse story, right? And they had Bloomington residents go and put their messages on these boxes and on the art. They've also created this website called Live from the Front Line, which Anthony's the lead storyteller for, but they've got artists and archivists who are telling the historical story of logistics in the Inland Empire and the ways in which that has, had unjust outcomes for communities of color. And so, just all these forms of cooperation are sort of a really powerful model for doing things that a small publication would otherwise have a real hard time doing.
Right.
Wow. Yeah, so I definitely want to save some time for us to go over two very important bills that are in consideration for the state of California, SB 1327 and AB 886. But yesterday, there was an announcement that a deal had been struck between Google and state lawmakers. Can you tell us what these bills consist of and why they should be on everybody's radar, whether you're in journalism or if you're just a community member in the Inland Empire?
Yeah, so
California.
Yeah, so these two bills, there have been policy initiatives to try to support local journalism that have been attempted throughout the U.S., even at the congressional level and overseas. Canada and Australia have two big bills that they've passed to support local journalism. One of these California bills, AB 886, was based on that Canada and Australia model, which is basically it would create a requirement for tech companies to negotiate with local news providers in order to incorporate their news into Google search results or Facebook news feed. When they share news, basically the law would say you've got to have some sort of agreement in place to make sure those news organizations are compensated, right? And the bill, there was haggling between small news outlets represented by the Lion, which is the local online independent news organization, the California Publishers Association, which represent bigger newspapers, but also the labor unions who have a stake in this stuff too, of course. And so there was those groups had sort of worked out some their challenges around the bill, and there was real solid positive momentum going forward. The one thing that's important about the bill is 70% of the revenue was supposed to go to journalists' salaries, right? And so when we think about what's the impediment to really quality journalism, it's having people working in newsrooms, right? And so that's a big bill. The other one, 1327, was a bill by a state senator named Glazer. And this bill was almost free for newspapers to send their publications to readers, because they said, if you want to have a well-functioning democracy, you're going to need an informed public, right? So public subsidies for journalism, they've been there since the beginning, right? Yeah. We're only, sort of rethinking now how to do that, because over the last 150 years, advertisers paid for it, but they're not anymore.
They don't need it.
They don't need it. Yeah, they can reach consumers without newspapers or news organizations. It's not just about newspapers.
They're spending their money on social media.
So.
Well, Denise, I know you have the next question about some exciting stuff at CSUSB.
Yes, tell us what's going on at Cal State San Bernardino with the journalism initiatives going on over there.
Yeah, so when I teach a course on the local news ecosystem, and in that course, we read about these challenges, and I had some students who were just like, hey, what can we do? What could we create, right? And there were some recommendations that we read about creating a hub, a place where journalists could come together and create what was needed for communities to know that's happening now with the Journalism Innovation Hub Plus Fund. We've been thinking over the last few months, and we've been talking with publishers and journalists and asking, what is CSUSB and what do other educational institutions in the area? What do we do special? What's our unfair advantage, right? That we can use to help local news outlets to be able to be successful. And some of the areas where we're working to develop partnerships to support local journalism, including around local news research, right? So there has been some good news research about local Inland Empire journalism. Listening Post Collective produced a really solid report in 2001, but we think things are changing fast, and it's important to document where resources are needed as bills like this are passed, as institutions are put in place like the Hub Plus Fund to support local journalism. We think research plays an important role in figuring out how to do that effectively, where to do that effectively, and to also document successes and challenges ongoing as initiatives get up and rolling. We think there's a real opportunity in the Inland Empire to build up journalism education pipelines and curriculum. The community colleges have associate's degrees in journalism. There's only one that I'm aware of, one journalism BA program, which is at CBU, which is great to have. But also, we've got public institutions, Cal State San Bernardino, UCR, where
one just got approved here at SBVC
for
not this year, but forthcoming years. So excited for that.
The other area where we're excited about is just innovative storytelling projects. So our student newspaper, the Coyote Chronicle, is working on extending their coverage out beyond campus, right?
Wow.
And we're certainly interested in having them partner with local news outlets to not to replace them, to support them.
Right.
But there's also the Extended Reality Lab on campus, the X-Real Lab. They do really cool storytelling with augmented reality or virtual reality. These sort of storytelling tools that are to have a place-based story. And a lot of the really important stories in the Inland Empire, warehousing, unhoused folks encampments, right? These are stories that, these sorts of tools can really put a person into a physical place, and in doing so, really be able to understand and empathize with local communities about really important circumstances that people should understand better.
Such a great way for historical documenting too, I think.
Oh, for sure.
And so that's awesome to be able to, have someone who literally has no clue, but then get a 360 understanding of what the problem or issue is at hand. So that's impressive to me.
Yeah, it's just it's using new tools, but it's exciting to think about how journalists can use these in ways that put the journalist toolkit to use with a new set of technologies.
And then we touched on cooperative journalism, and this is just another aspect of that. The local community newspapers can reach out to the colleges, to the junior colleges, to the high schools even, to get that other additional aspect of reporting and cover things that maybe they normally couldn't.
Yeah, no, and I've talked to publishers who've said, when they get a fellowship, right, that they have an opportunity to fill, sometimes they're looking over to LA to find a journalist that's a really solid for that role. We gotta have folks, and we do have folks, right? But we also need to build up that infrastructure and that muscle in terms of being able to do solid local storytelling.
Yeah.
Well, TC, Dr. Corrigan, thank you so much for joining us. And I also just want to give a special thanks to Inland Empire Community Foundation for sponsoring and supporting us with this podcast, as well as SBVC's Institute of Media Arts. That's the podcast studio that we're currently in. And thank you very much.
Thank you to our listeners for tuning in.
Awesome. Thank you both.
Of course. We'll see you guys next time.